Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the biodiversity of Africa's Congo's rainforest and discoveries of new amphibian and reptile species and the challenges of scientific expeditions with my guest, Eli Greenbaum. He is professor of biological sciences and director of Biodiversity Collections at the University of Texas, El Paso. As a herpetologist and evolutionary biologist, he is a world expert on the amphibian and reptile fauna of Central Africa and has discovered over 24 new species, plus many more that are yet to be described. He has authored over 125 scientific papers, the book Emerald Labyrinth, Scientists' Adventures in the Jungles of the Congo, and his latest book, Venomous River, Changing Climate, Imperiled Forests, and a Scientist's Race to Find New Species in the Congo. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Your book is a gripping story about your harrowing experiences making new discoveries. You have led over 11 expeditions into Central Africa, and you have had to deal with so many different problems in going into an area that has had political corruption, colonial history, tropical diseases, populations that have rarely seen a white man, and yet you have had a fantastic team of local scientists helping you go into areas that very few people have ever gone into. Can you describe the Central Congo, where you went, and why you chose that area?
Yes, I'm happy to. I've been working as a herpetologist, that's a scientist who specializes on amphibians and reptiles, in Africa for over 20 years. As I was getting my career started in Africa, I kind of looked through the literature and wanted to see, okay, where are the blind spots about our knowledge of herpetological diversity? And really, it's in the lowland rainforest of Central Africa. So the biggest chunk of that is in the country we now refer to as Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly the Belgian Congo until 1960. And during the colonial era, there were a couple Belgian herpetologists who did a fair amount of work and spent their entire careers trying to uncover the amphibian and reptile biodiversity from this area. But most of their work was focused on national parks, including what we now call Virunga National Park, Africa's oldest park in the eastern part of the country. In fact, most of their work was in this mountainous area called the Albertine Rift in the eastern part of the country. So as far as the lowland Congo basin goes, they did relatively little work there, and it's probably because even in the colonial era, there were enormous challenges with logistics, just getting around, and then the big one is tropical disease. So there are many, many potentially deadly, crippling, debilitating tropical diseases in Central Africa, and it's probably due to the long history of coevolution between humans and our close ancestors, including chimpanzees and bonobos, and these tropical diseases that have had all of this long history to evolve with us.
We know that tropical forests cover about 1/10 of the land surface on the Earth, but they are home to over 2/3 of the planet's terrestrial biodiversity. You're talking about an area that still has species that haven't been discovered. You went in and You asked the local villagers if they found any snakes or frogs or other kinds of amphibians, lizards, and so forth to bring them to you. And they're very familiar with them, but some of them are very dangerous, venomous. You weren't worried about working with them?
Whenever we go into a remote area of Congo, the first question that everyone has is, what is this guy doing here? What is he looking for? What does he want? So we spend a fair bit of time with them whenever we arrive in a new place to explain who we are, what we're doing, and we make it very clear that it is a strong collaboration between myself and my Congolese collaborators. And we explain that the amphibians and reptiles are poorly known and that we're really interested in learning about the biodiversity in their backyards. And then once they realize that, they are often very willing to help us look for these things. Of course, we tell them, do not try to kill any dangerous snakes. If you happen to see one, please bring it to our attention and we'll go get it, because we have a lot of experience working with venomous snakes. But we have to be really, really careful, because if you get bit by a venomous snake in the middle of Congo, there's a really good chance you will not be able to get any medical attention in time. So we're super careful when we're handling those snakes.
Every night as you traveled, you had to set up camp. You tried to find a local village. You met people from different indigenous groups. One of them, we called the Pygmies, were not always treated so well by the other indigenous groups in the Congo. Can you describe the interrelationships that you encountered?
Yes, the Central African hunter-gathering peoples, which have been known as Pygmies in the wider world in the past, and also known as the forest people from Colin Turnbull's famous book from a few decades ago. They're fantastic. Historically, they have made their living in the forest. They get everything that they need to survive from the forest. They are the indigenous people of Central Africa. So because they have such an intimate knowledge of the forest and the animals that live in it, it's always a pleasure to work with them because they know the animals, they know where they live. I can learn so much from them. So the problem is that over time, other non-indigenous groups in Central Africa have taken advantage of their technological advancements and their association in the past with colonial powers to kind of do things with the Central African groups that I would say are not fair, is a polite way to put it. And we did encounter many examples of that during our travels. We had started to work with a local indigenous man who was helping us find some rare species. He had managed to capture a very rare snake. And as he was bringing it to us, there was a policeman that, for whatever reason, just didn't like that he was collaborating with us, so he just beat him up. We had to have a meeting with all the people involved to try to diffuse that situation. But after that happened, we decided, hey, from now on, when we work with these forest people, we're going to make sure that we only work in areas where they are, so that there can't be interference from other groups that think that they have dominion over them.
You discovered over 24 new species. Were they all snakes, frogs, lizards? Were they different species, different genuses, different orders?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the study, right? But if we just kind of focus on the new species that I've described in Africa, it's a lot of frogs, many different snakes, and several different groups of lizards, including one lizard that we named after a guide named Asakulu, who unfortunately was killed shortly after he guided us through a very remote mountainous area in 2009. And when we did the DNA analysis of that new species, we realized that it was part of this group that should be recognized as a new genus. So we named that new genus Congo lacerta, which means Congo lizard. Finding a new genus is quite rare nowadays, although it still continues to happen. But new species are being described on a weekly basis, so we have a long way to go until we find and describe them all.
You have to be careful about all sorts of insects as well. Scorpions. One time you jumped out of your tent and forgot to shake your boot out to make sure there wasn't a scorpion in it.
That's right. There are plenty of venomous creatures in the Congo Basin forest. That was part of the reason why I named the book Venomous River. Some of them are so poorly known, like the snakes, that we don't really know what would happen if someone got stung. So whenever we come across any species of scorpion or any species of snake that we are not familiar with and could be potentially deadly, we're very, very careful. So I got in the habit during roughly 10 weeks of the expedition of knocking my boots together and kind of pointing them down towards the ground so that if anything had crawled into them in the middle of the night, I wouldn't be putting my foot in there and trapping myself against something potentially venomous.
Were you ever tempted to collect insects and see if there were new species of them?
Yeah, so every once in a while, if we come across something really interesting that's an invertebrate, we will collect it. I did collect the scorpions that are mentioned in the book because I wasn't sure how rare they are. Luckily, I had a colleague at the American Museum in New York who was able to identify them for me. And I do recall one year being in a marsh and finding a praying mantis that had these beautiful neon pastel colors to it. So I wanted to take photos and video, and I did end up collecting it. Still waiting for an ID on that thing. And then in Burundi one year, there was a small protected area of rainforest that we were exploring, and I found an orange tarantula. Still waiting for an ID on that. So every once in a while we do collect other things, but of course most of our efforts are on amphibians and reptiles.
During those 10 weeks, you were basically sleeping in your own tent. There aren't any motels, hotels, or other accommodations for you. You had to set up a lab where you actually did some DNA research study to see if these were new species that you were discovering. How did you preserve these specimens? How many did you bring back with you?
We did bring back many different samples and natural history specimens. So I'm the director of the UTEP Biodiversity Collections. The reason why we needed to do that is because in the middle of the jungle, we often don't know what we have found. So it takes many weeks of careful study, measurements. With reptiles, we'll often count the number of scales on the head, on the belly, and so on. And then you have to go into the historical literature, which is often in another language. Of course, the Belgian herpetologists that I mentioned, they published most of their work in French. And then we need little samples to do our DNA analyses, and we can't do that in the middle of the jungle in Congo. We have to have a sophisticated evolutionary genetics laboratory for that. So what we do is we'll just take like a scale or a little piece of muscle or some other kind of tissue that has DNA in it and just put it in a little vial with ethanol to kind of lock it in. And then when we bring it back to the laboratory, we can put it through the processes that we need to do to isolate the DNA, get genetic and genomic data out of the DNA, analyze it, and then that allows us to make comparisons to all of the other samples that we've collected over the years, so we can see how a particular specimen might be related to others that we have found in the past. And sometimes we find incredible connections that way. Sometimes we'll find a new species where the nearest sample is hundreds of miles away. That's how poorly known the Congo Basin is, and why it's so important to do this biodiversity science, because understanding the evolutionary relationships of these organisms, where they occur, whether they are known to science or not, that's really important as a first step to hoping to conserve them for conservation practices in the future.
Traveling through the Congo isn't so easy. There aren't roads to go the hundreds of miles that you needed to go. There weren't fancy ships or other kinds of boats. You went often in dugout canoes with outboard motors. You had a problem getting fuel often. You really really have a challenge in terms of transporting your crew, your equipment. Explain some of those challenges, because you went up numerous rivers and sometimes they weren't always easy to traverse.
Yes, that is correct. Most of the traveling that we did on this expedition that I describe in the book was by dugout canoe, hundreds and hundreds of miles. So we started in the capital, Kinshasa. There, in that area, transportation isn't bad, but we were going to a pretty remote area from there, so we got in this rickety wooden boat. I had thought it would take all day to get to this first place on the stop called Kwamutu, but it ended up taking almost 2 days because the motors don't work well. We did run out of fuel and kind of have to search around for fuel when we ran out. There are numerous logistical challenges in Congo that are usually not a problem in other areas of the world. And I think it's because Congo, because of its dark colonial history and the dictatorship of a guy named Mobutu for 30 years or so, who stole a lot of the money that was supposed to be being used to keep up the infrastructure from the colonial era. Place is really behind the rest of the world in a lot of areas. Just getting around, just logistics of travel is very, very challenging. You really do have to roll with the punches, and there were plenty of punches that I talk about in the book.
The book, Venomous River, Changing Climate, Imperiled Forests, and a Scientist's Race to Find New Species in the Congo, was so thrilling to me. I stopped working for a weekend and just sat and read. It should be a movie, but you describe so much in your book. It's for the general audience, even though the scientists might enjoy looking at the 46 pages of references. That's not necessary to read because your story is captivating. I would like to have you tell us more about your challenges in making these discoveries and how important the rainforest is when we return in a moment with my guest, Eli Greenbaum.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Eli Greenbaum, who's Professor of Biological Sciences and Director of Biodiversity Collections at the University of Texas, El Paso. He has authored Venomous River, Changing Climate, Imperiled Forests, and a Scientist's Race to Find New Species in the Congo. Not only did you have to deal with the environmental conditions, which are difficult. It's a rainforest, which means you had to deal with rain, you had to deal with humidity, you had to deal with the infectious diseases in the area, you had to make friends with the local villagers, you also had to deal with a crew because there weren't any restaurants to go to. You had to take your own cook, and the cook had to go find food for you in the villages. You stuck with fish because you didn't want to eat the bushmeat, and that is a horrible problem going on where the mammals from the bonobos, chimpanzees, and other animals are being eaten and killed by the local people. Tell us about those conflicts that you had to deal with.
Bushmeat is a term used for wild animals that are hunted so that people can get sources of protein. Unfortunately, throughout the world, if we consider all of the tropical forests across the world, about half of them are considered to be defaunated for mammals. That means they've had significant declines in mammal populations in recent years over hunting for the bushmeat trade. And the thing that's changed in the last few decades is that it's easier to get into remote areas. Weaponry is better. There's a larger market from the growing human population that has money to spend on this meat. So especially the larger mammals have really been hit hard hard. So just to give you a sad example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the book is centered, I talk about the decline of elephants. Back in the early 20th century, there were hundreds of thousands of them. But over time, because of overhunting, there was a scramble for ivory, of course, which the Heart of Darkness talks about. They're now down by 99%. So the problem with that is that large animals disperse large seeds for large trees, and those larger trees are responsible for sequestering a larger amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is the climate change connection. But as far as the logistics of trying to find food and have a cook, that was a major challenge on the expedition. When it began, we had an 18-year-old cook named Elvis, of all things, and he was great. And we were just working in a reserve not far from the capital city of Kinshasa. But once we got to the point where we were ready to get into one of these rickety, leaking wooden boats and just go off to the wild green yonder, he took one look at it and said, you know what, I quit. So we had to just leave. We just had to leave without a cook, and I was really worried about this and thinking, how can we go on a 10-week expedition without a cook? And as we're pulling out of port in Kinshasa to head off, we had been hassled quite a bit by the local port authorities, and we kind of went around a bend, and there was a guy who had obviously been trying to hide from the port authorities because he wasn't visible on that little bend as we turned around it. And it was just crazy because it was 100 degrees outside, and he's wearing this full-length woman's winter coat, and he jumps onto the boat at the very last minute to avoid those port authorities. We would find out later why. He became our cook because he said, yeah, I can cook well. So we gave him kind of a probationary period, and he was very resourceful, making these delicious meals with very limited ingredients. But he was slowly revealed to not be who he professed to be, and we found out as the expedition continued into more and more remote areas that our cook was a very dangerous figure.
I think we should probably leave the mystery for people to read the book and discover who he was, because those are the kinds of incredible stories that you relay in your writing about your expeditions. We should also point out that the Congo has surrounding countries. Can you tell us about those and how many parks and reserves are protected both in the Congo and in the surrounding area? Because that is what is so important to preserve and protect to help solve our climate crisis. I was fascinated to learn about the rainforest bogs or marshy areas and how important they are.
Yes, the peatlands are really important for sequestering carbon dioxide, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases that everyone's focused on in conversations about climate change. In recent years, we didn't realize how extensive those peatlands are in Central Africa, and I talk about those in some of the areas where we visited. They kind of look like really muddy, dark brown areas of water that don't seem that interesting, but underneath the surface, they are holding on to enormous amounts of carbon. And the concern is if developers go into those areas and chop down the forest in those peatland areas and try to exploit them for all kinds of natural resources, that the carbon could be released. And so that's been called a potential climate bomb. But as far as protected areas go, of course, there's the Republic of the Congo, just west of Democratic Republic of the Congo. So it's just on the other side of the Congo River. In the northwest, not far from where we worked, is the Central African Republic. And then as you go to the east, where the Albertine Rift is, on the other side of those mountains, you have South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and then to the south is Zambia and Angola. So that's sort of the geography of it.
Because of your studies in the area and your research, did that not help the government to set aside more land as parks and reserves?
Yes. Probably the most biodiverse area in continental Africa is the Albertine Rift Mountains I was telling you about along the eastern border of DR Congo. And within that area, the crown jewel of that really hypo-biodiverse area is this place called the Atomwe Plateau. I was lucky enough to work there a few times and found many species that had been described just after World War II and had never been seen again. So we sort of rediscovered those, and we found many new species, including the Congo lacerta example I gave you. Based on those discoveries and the fact that many of those species are endemic to the Atomwe Plateau, that means that they occur there and as far as we know, nowhere else in the world. That helped bolster efforts to make Atomwe into a reserve about a decade ago. It also helped figure out where the borders of the reserve should be to include the habitats of as many of these species that are threatened with extinction as possible. In 2020, there was a study that came out in Science that said worldwide, only about 15% of the land is protected. It's less than 10% in the oceans. But the problem is that it has to be effectively protected. There has to be law enforcement. There have to be park rangers enforcing the laws of these protected areas. And if you consider that, it's only a fraction of that. So we have a long way to go to really increase the protected areas of these fragile ecosystems. And unfortunately, we're finding that climate change is starting to penetrate into even these very isolated protected areas.
Why is it so important that people understand what's involved in going on these expeditions, making these discoveries, and saving these rainforests?
These rainforests and the biodiversity that they contain are essential to maintain life on Earth. If they disappear and we're losing a soccer field of rainforest and the biodiversity they contain to every 5 seconds, we're really going to be in trouble as a human species.
There are so many challenges, and you make it so clear that we do need to protect these areas, both for the health of other species as well as our health, and there are threats that have to be dealt with: overpopulation, resource exploitation, political issues, diseases. But your book, Venomous River, Changing Climate, Imperiled Forests, and a Scientist's Race to Find New Species in the Congo, is an incredible story of scientific discoveries. In this book, you show beautiful photographs of colorful frogs, lizards, and other creatures. Why are they so colorful?
There's a lot of different reasons why they could be colorful. So I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with this idea of aposematic coloration, where poisonous frogs, for example, advertise that they're poisonous with those bright colors to would-be predators so that they don't get eaten. And in fact, we published a study back in 2019 that provided evidence that one of the largest toads in the Congo basin, this thing called Channing's toad, seems to mimic the head of gaboon vipers. Gaboon vipers are these really large, stocky, venomous snakes that are relatively common in the lowland rainforest of Central Africa and some other forests in other areas of Africa. They have the longest fangs of any venomous snake in the world. Color is a way of sending communication both within species and between species for everything from mating to predation.
I certainly hope everyone picks up this book, Venomous River, because it's a travel story, a scientific story, a political story. It's a little bit about everything. You write it for the general public, and yet there's scientific information. You want people to know what's involved in finding the species on this planet, and you point out that there are still lots of species out there.
Not everyone is willing to take the risks that I have taken to do this kind of work. So there are enormous areas of the Congo basin that we have no idea what could still be there.
I wish that you had written a book about every one of your expeditions, because your writing is so interesting, so captivating, to let people know what's involved in making scientific discoveries, why it's so important to save our ecosystems, relationships with the people and the animals and the plants. Wonderful that you have written Venomous River. Thank you.
Every time I go on one of these expeditions, doesn't matter which corner of the Congo we're talking about, I come back with at least a dozen new species to science. And because it takes many, many months, sometimes years of very careful, meticulous work to describe a species, I'm going to be busy until I retire. And luckily, those natural history specimens will be there long after I'm gone for the next generation to continue the work.
Thank you so very much for your excellent scientific work. Thank you so very much for informing the general public of what a scientist has to do and writing such a fascinating story of your expedition. And I hope that everybody picks up your book, Venomous River, Changing Climate, Imperiled Forests, and a Scientist's Race to Find New Species in the Congo. Thank you for being my guest.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
I have been speaking with Eli Greenbaum, who is Professor of Biological Sciences and Director of Biodiversity Collections at the University of Texas, El Paso, and is a world expert on the amphibian and reptile fauna of Central Africa. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.